In part 1's video for Rule 11, do not bother children when they are skateboarding, there was a fair amount of talk about kids and skateboarding. Peterson made the case that kids need to encounter risk and danger as they're growing up. I didn't disagree. Peterson also brought in the depth psychologists and Orwell to try and argue that socialists are trying to stifle the human spirit, which I did disagree with. Particularly Peterson's interpretation of Orwell's The Road to Wigan Pier. Jung's psychological scalpel was introduced, wherein you infer the motivation of some action based on the outcome. I question the veracity of doing this. And that's where we left off in this chapter. Ready for more? This video made possible thanks to the continuing support of viewers, patrons, and PayPal pals like you. Thanks! Hi! Welcome back to the channel. We are starting the non-skateboarding sections of this chapter on letting kids skateboard. And the content advisory should give you some idea of the type of fun we're going to be having in these sections. Speaking of, let's get the visual cue refresher out of the way so we can start. This indicates I'm paraphrasing the book. This means I'm responding to what was written. And this means we're talking science, either things Peterson referenced or research I'm bringing to the table. Alrighty, let's not bother some kids skateboarding through environmentalism. It's been a bit since we last talked about Peterson's friend Chris, so let's revisit what we know about him. And this is primarily coming from Rule 3, make friends with people who want the best for you. Peterson and Chris had similar interests. Peterson described Chris as a natural engineer, but noted that something had gone wrong in his family because Chris was angry, resentful, and without hope. Peterson also described Chris's truck as the exoskeleton of a nihilist. They would also hang out with Chris's younger cousin Ed. Peterson described neither of them as being improved by marijuana. The ceiling particles guy was a friend of Ed's. Deeper into this chapter, Peterson reveals that Chris had a psychotic break before ending his life. He speculated that this may have been a consequence of what Peterson perceived as Chris's nihilistic worldview. Okay, back to letting kids skateboard. We start Chris's section with Peterson saying that Chris was possessed by a profoundly anti-human spirit that was largely centered around guilt and that this hurt his mental health. Peterson notes that Chris had also moved around a bit.
Fights with native kids were a too common part of his experience during those moves. It's no overstatement to point out that such kids were, on average, rougher than the white kids, or that they were touchier, and they had their reasons. I knew this well from my own experience.
Before we get back to Peterson's story, I just wanted to stop here and take a moment. As we touched on in Rule 6 regarding Peterson's artist friend who is a member of one of Canada's First Nations groups, Canada's history with the Indigenous people isn't the best. Peterson himself talked about his friend's experiences at the residential schools. I bring this up because I'm surprised with the incongruity in how Peterson talks about members of the Indigenous groups. This will only become more apparent. Peterson had a rocky friendship with another boy, Rene, when he was young. Rene was Métis.
It was rocky because the situation was complex. There was a large cultural divide between Rene and me. His clothes were dirtier. He was rougher in speech and attitude. I had skipped a grade in school and was, in addition, small for my age. Rene was a big, smart, good-looking kid, and he was tough.
It might just be me, but elaborating on the cultural differences that Peterson noticed would have been more interesting and helpful than just his clothes were dirtier.
We were in grade 6 together, in a class taught by my father. Rene was caught chewing gum. "Rene," said my father, "spit that gum out. You look like a cow." "Ha ha," I laughed under my breath. Rene the cow. Rene might have been a cow, but there was nothing wrong with his hearing. "Peterson," he said, "after school, you're dead."
Peterson recalls that they had planned to see a movie together that night, but figured those plans were off given the threat. And he says he tried to get to his bike to GTFO, but Rene beat him there.
I crouched down and hid behind some bikes, keeping an eye on Rene. "Rene," I yelled, "I'm sorry I called you a cow. Let's quit fighting." He started to approach me again. I said, "Rene, I am sorry I said that. Really, and I still want to go to the movie with you. This wasn't just a tactic. I meant it. Otherwise, what happened next would not have happened. Renee stopped circling. Then he stared at me. Then he broke into tears. Then he ran off. That was native white relationships in a nutshell in our hard little town. We never did go to a movie together.
I'm not entirely sure what message we're supposed to be getting from this side story, and I feel like there's a lot more going on than Peterson has shared here. I know friendships at that age can be unstable, oscillating between being friends or not within a day even. But was this the event that ended a friendship? Had they been pretty good friends before this? Was the movie just an attempt by the parents at nurturing a friendship? I have more questions than answers, and this wasn't even the point of this section. Peterson says Chris wouldn't fight back against the native kids because he thought it was the right thing to do.
Over time, step by step, Chris withdrew from the world. It was partly his guilt. He developed a deep hatred for masculinity and masculine activity. He saw going to school, or working, or finding a girlfriend as part of the same process that had led to the colonization of North America, the horrible nuclear stalemate of the Cold War, and the despoiling of the planet.
Chris sounds like he was a very sensitive, but troubled person. It never ceases to amaze me that Peterson ascribes Chris's problems to nihilism and not something like a troubled home life and/or some untreated psychological disorder.
Chris had read some books about Buddhism and felt that negation of his own being was ethically required in the light of the current world situation. He came to believe that the same applied to others.
The application to others will be explained, but given the current world situation, I'm kind of feeling at least part of this. We're destroying the planet, killing each other, and a chunk of the population seems to not care. I absolutely feel some level of existential angst about all this. I'm personally more worried about the people who want to stick their heads in the sand and think that everything's fine, nothing needs to change, but that's probably going to be an unsettlable difference between Peterson and I. Chris was apparently Tyler Durdening before Fight Club. On the way back to their apartment from the bar one night,
Chris started to snap the side view mirrors off parked cars, one after the other. I said, "Quit that, Chris. What possible good is it going to do to make the people who own these cars miserable?" He told me that they were all part of the frenetic human activity that was ruining everything, and that they deserved whatever they got. I said that taking revenge on people who were just living normal lives was not going to help anything.
my husband and I joke that I inherited my dad's luck on being disproportionately on the receiving end of things like this, so on this front, Chris can go fuck himself. Although the way Peterson describes this, it sounds like Chris got through several mirrors before Peterson said anything. You'd think one mirror getting snapped off would be enough, but apparently not. Maybe they were drunk. This next part gets a little complicated. When Peterson was in grad school, Chris moved in with his family for a little bit, which included his wife Tammy and their baby Michaela.
Chris had also been friends with Tammy back in Fairview, and held out hopes of more than friendship. That complicated the situation even more, but not precisely in the manner you might think. Chris started by hating men, but he ended by hating women. He wanted them, but he had rejected education and career and desire. He smoked heavily and was unemployed. Unsurprisingly, therefore, he was not of much interest to women. That made him bitter. I tried to convince him that the path he had chosen was only going to lead to further ruin. He needed to develop some humility. He needed to get a life.
This hating men and the masculine part is grabbing my attention. In the friendship chapter, Peterson speculated that a lot of Chris's trouble stemmed from his father being chronically ill and not being able to pay as much attention as Peterson thought Chris wanted from him. And maybe that's part of it. But based on what my dad told me of his home life and early adulthood, it kind of sounds like Chris may have had a harder start than he'd let on or Peterson had caught on to. From my experience, rarely will an abuser broadcast to the world that they act that way behind closed doors. It's all about keeping up appearances, after all. Being the literal whipping boy at home led my dad to some self-destructive behaviors in his early adulthood, like almost joining up with a biker gang and trying to kill himself with alcohol, destructive. And I don't know what changed it for him, but at this point I can't know. In any event, it sounds like Chris was dealing with a lot of mental shit. What's not clear to me is if Chris was a proto-incel, or if this is what the narrative has ended up centering around after the fact. In either case, Chris needed to spend some time and work on himself before trying to land a life partner. I can only hope that Peterson didn't directly tell Chris to develop some humility and to get a life. I understand the frustration of watching a friend's life spiral, but I would imagine advice of this sort being met with a "fuck you" right back. And maybe this is an honest retelling of how things went down between them, but for readers who may find themselves in Chris's shoes. The only direct advice for somebody in Chris's position comes towards the end of this chapter in a section called "Toughen Up, You Weasel." So, yeah. My point here is that finding a life partner wasn't going to fix Chris, or anybody else in his position. Something that isn't clear to me is how exactly Chris hated masculinity, men, and later women, and the feminine role. I'm not sure if this is an inference of Peterson's, or something that was said by Chris at some point, but not included in the stories Peterson shares. How did Chris actually hate these things, beyond not really properly launching into adulthood? If property damage and some burned food was the extent of it, saying he hated those things seems like a stretch. Peterson shares an incident where Chris was supposed to cook dinner and it didn't go well. Chris was cooking burgers, but was also trying to fix something going on with the stove leg, and by the time Tammy came home, the burgers were burning.
My wife knew his tricks. She knew he was burning dinner on purpose. He resented having to make it. He resented the feminine role, even though the household duties were split in a reasonable manner, even though he knew that perfectly well. He was fixing the stove to provide a plausible, even credible excuse for burning the food. When she pointed out what he was doing, he played the victim, but he was deeply and dangerously furious. Part of him, and not the good part, was convinced that he was smarter than everyone else. It was a blow to his pride that she could see through his tricks. It was an ugly situation.
I can only assume the insight into Chris's head comes from the Jungian infer motivation thing from the last section. Having lived with somebody with ADHD for a while, these sorts of things can happen with no ill intent. Trying to complete task A, but something's not working right, so now task B is find a thing. But the thing's not where it should be, so now we're at task C, digging through the closet. This goes on several steps later, and now our floors are clean, but task A is certainly not done. As I said earlier, besides Peterson saying this is the why behind Chris's actions, we don't really get any direct examples for Chris resenting the feminine role. Maybe he was just a really shitty cook. That happens. It's not a coincidence that I stopped eating everything covered in ketchup when I moved in with my husband. Call it bad faith if you want, but I'm not convinced that Chris is getting a fair shake here. Tammy couldn't live in those conditions, so took Michaela somewhere else. It seems like we're not getting the full story here. When I bounced this off my husband, he couldn't believe that Peterson would keep Chris in the house and let Tammy and their daughter leave. Later that year, while Tammy and Michaela were still gone, Peterson's brother and sister-in-law came out for a visit. And one day, the sister-in-law, the brother, and Chris went out for a walk, but when they got back, Peterson said Chris looked out of sorts. They had dinner and a reasonable evening, and people went to bed. But Peterson's spidey sense was going off.
I couldn't sleep. Something wasn't right. It was in the air. I knocked quietly on Chris's door and went in without waiting for an answer into his room. He was awake on the bed, staring at the ceiling, as I knew he would be. I sat down beside him. I knew him very well. I talked him down from his murderous rage. Then I went back to bed and slept.
The next morning, Peterson's brother remarked on not being able to sleep well and asked if something was wrong.
I told my brother that Chris wasn't doing so well. I didn't tell him that he was lucky to be alive, that we all were. The spirit of Cain had visited our house, but we were left unscathed.
Murderous rage? Lucky to be alive? If Chris was that close to killing people, why is he not getting professional help? If Chris was walking that close to the edge, he needed to be inpatient for everyone's safety. This is part of why I have a hard time buying Peterson's explanation of these events and what was supposedly going on in Chris's head.
Maybe I had picked up some change in scent that night, when death hung in the air. Chris had a very bitter odor. He showered frequently, but the towels and the sheets picked up the smell, It was impossible to get them clean. It was the product of a psyche and a body that did not operate harmoniously. A social worker I knew, who also knew Chris, told me of her familiarity with that odor. Everyone at her workplace knew of it, although they only discussed it in hushed tones. They called it the smell of the unemployable.
This led to a very strange rabbit hole. So, when I was an undergrad, I was an animal care technician for a rat lab. And part of my responsibilities was coming in on the weekends and checking on the little guys, making sure their food and water was okay, nothing had leaked, all that stuff. And it got to a point where I could open the door to the building and just know that one of the rats had died. Death certainly has a smell. I've also heard that healthcare workers can sometimes pick up on the subtle cues that somebody under their care is going to die in the near future. And if I remember correctly, it has something to do with the person's smell. One Google search later, and there's a hint that maybe people with schizophrenia have a slightly different body odor because of a particular fatty acid excreted in sweat. But papers that reference the Brewer paper don't touch on body odor, just the person's ability to smell. And I'm unclear if this is because there's been a failure to replicate that body odor sweat metabolite finding, or if there's just not interest in it. So we're going to leave this as a tentative maybe. This talk about Chris's odor, though, doesn't improve my view of how it was for him living with Peterson. It would be hard to covertly wash bedding and towels repeatedly when someone is staying with you. Assuming what Peterson said here is true, and nothing was directly said to Chris, he would probably have noticed them washing things he came into contact with. Also, saying this smell was due to a disharmony between psyche and body? Come on. Maybe it was the thing I found about schizophrenia, in which case, it would have to do with the disordered metabolic process, not the psyche being out of whack. Finally, the smell of the unemployable. Such compassion on display here. Peterson jumps to living in Boston with his family, and at this point he's only catching up on the phone occasionally with Chris, but things seem to be going better for him. The day before Chris's 40th birthday, he called Peterson to let him know he was getting some short stories published. And the next day, Chris took his life. I spared you the details that Peterson included of how Chris did this. And something I've seen in reading bipolar and depression boards is that if somebody's been struggling with depression for a while and they suddenly seem to get better, to be careful. They might be putting things in order before they actually try to end their life. And maybe that's what went on here. Peterson shifts to a TEDx talk he'd given. The speaker before him was an expert on computationally intelligent surfaces, but gave his talk on how environmentally dangerous we are as a species.
Like Chris, like far too many people, he had become anti-human to the core. He had not walked as far down the road as my friend, but the same dread spirit animated them both.
I would argue that talking about the disastrous effect we're having on the environment isn't anti-human. It's fucking realistic. Not talking about these things isn't going to change the projections of how much longer the majority of life can survive on this planet. We have to talk about climate change, and we have to do something about this. We're running out of time here. Reframing Peterson's logic, it seems more anti-human to ignore this issue because it's uncomfortable to talk about and let our fucking species die. Because it hurts our fifis. This other speaker's talk included shots of a Chinese factory, and
he told the audience, filled with bright young people, of the decision he and his wife had made to limit their number of children to 1. He told them it was something they should all consider if they wanted to regard themselves as ethical people. I felt that such a decision was properly considered, but only in his particular case, where less than 1 might have been even better.
What a passive-aggressive jab at the end there. What is so threatening about somebody talking about the environment and including the idea that maybe we don't need to have that many kids? For most of the world, we're at a point where most kids aren't dying before they can grow up and have kids of their own. In order to continue the species, we don't need to be having more than the replacement rate, so 2 kids for 2 parents. It's fine.
The many Chinese students in attendance sat stolidly through his moralizing. They thought, perhaps, of their parents' escape from the horrors of Mao's Cultural Revolution and its one-child policy. They thought, perhaps, of the vast improvement in living standard and freedom provided by the very same factories. A couple of them said as much in the question period that followed.
This took a turn. So, a note about Chinese students based on my interactions with international students or Chinese colleagues. If they are a Chinese immigrant or the children of immigrants, maybe their family was fleeing exactly what Peterson was talking about. But if they're international students, chances are their family's still back in China. But for the Chinese people I've interacted with, the one-child policy wasn't seen as that big a deal. It did lead to some population demographics that would suggest a strong preference towards male children. I won't deny that. But the one-child policy wasn't seen as some draconian overreach by the government. Peterson and I have been interacting with different people, it would seem. He's bringing in the factories as something that improves freedom. In China. Really? 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 Cool story, bro.
Would the professor have reconsidered his opinions if he knew where such ideas can lead? I would like to say yes, but I don't believe it. I think he could have known, but refused to. Worse, perhaps, he knew, but didn't care. Or knew, and was headed there, voluntarily, in any case.
Don't beat around the bush, Peterson. Where exactly do these ideas lead? Be precise in your speech. People feeling bad about trashing the environment? So-called anti-human philosophies? But of course, Daddy Peterson knows best. He knows exactly where these ideas can lead and how it's ruining things for men. Although, in fairness, I am kind of pulling a Dick Advisor move by wanting these setups pay off right now. Assuming the next section is the payoff, that is. This section begins with Peterson giving 2 comparison points for the progression of environmentalist thought. Thomas Huxley telling the British Parliament in the late 1800s that we couldn't possibly deplete the oceans, and The Silent Spring being published in 1962. This wasn't ringing a bell for me, so Silent Spring documented the environmental problems caused by pesticides. Its publication led to the banning of DDT in agriculture and helped change the US policy on pesticide and spur the formation of the EPA.
We've only just developed the conceptual tools and technologies that allow us to understand the web of life, however imperfectly. We deserve a bit of sympathy, in consequence, for the hypothetical outrage of our destructive behavior. Sometimes we don't know any better. Sometimes we do know better, but haven't yet formulated any practical alternatives.
That's right, dear viewer. Sharp turn into a form of anti-environmentalism, which is even more remarkable coming from Peterson, a self-proclaimed champion of personal responsibility who is now saying, oh, we didn't really know better, so cut us a break, eh?
It's not as if life is easy for human beings after all, even now. And it's only a few decades ago that the majority of human beings were starving, diseased, and illiterate.
Reference 169 is a piece on Reason.com by Marian Tuppy. In this, Tuppy argues that wealth can grow indefinitely. She claims that the concerns from the political left about the consequences to the planet are unfounded, as the British Industrial Revolution saved European forests. I am unclear how this supports Peterson's statement. A useful reference would have included data about starvation, disease, or literacy rates over time.
Wealthy as we are, increasingly everywhere, we still only live decades that can be counted on our fingers. Even at present, it is the rare and fortunate family that does not contain at least one member with a serious illness, and all will face that problem eventually. We do what we can to make the best of things, in our vulnerability and fragility, and the planet is harder on us than we are on it. We could cut ourselves some slack.
Because we haven't cracked the code to invulnerability to disease or immortality, we need to not be so hard on ourselves for how we're making the planet uninhabitable? It doesn't logically follow, Peterson.
Human beings are, after all, seriously remarkable creatures. We have no peers, and it's not clear that we have any real limits. Things happen now that appeared humanly impossible even at the same time in the recent past when we began to wake up to our planet-sized responsibilities.
His examples include comparing sports records from 60 years ago to now, parkour, and other extreme sports. Here we go again with the exceptionalism of humans, but we do have limits. We can augment them to some extent, but we do have limits. And once again, I'm left asking the question of, what does this have to do with environmentalism? Or even kids skateboarding? Pivot.
The boys who shot up Columbine High School, who we discussed earlier, had appointed themselves judges of the human race. Like the TEDx professor, although much more extreme, like Chris, my doomed friend. For
redacted.
The more literate of the two killers, human beings were a failed and corrupt species. Once a presupposition such as that is accepted, its inner logic will inevitably manifest itself.
Now he's making the case that being concerned about the environment will lead to suicide or mass shootings? Really? Also, it's pretty fucking rich that Peterson is saying that one of the Columbine shooters viewed humans as a failed and corrupt species, when Peterson has basically said as much in this very book. Repeatedly.
If something is a plague, as David Attenborough has it, or a cancer, as the Club of Rome claimed, the person who eradicates it is a hero, a veritable planetary savior in this case.
The relevant quote from Attenborough is,
"We are a plague on the Earth. It's coming home to roost over the next 50 years or so. It's not just climate change, it's sheer space, places to grow food for this enormous horde. Either we limit our population growth or the natural world will do it for us, and the natural world is doing it for us right now."
And given our pace in using up the world, I wouldn't disagree with Attenborough's assessment. Reference 171 is a bit of a Matryoshka doll, so bear with me. It contains mankind at the turning point, a medical aspect of the population problem, has a human species become a cancer on the planet, a theoretical view of population growth as a sign of pathology, and the first global revolution. For the first reference, Peterson pulls out the quote, "The Earth has cancer, and the cancer is man." Then he notes that this idea was taken from the second reference and developed by the third. Finally, the quote he includes from the last reference is, "The common enemy of humanity is man." In searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. All these dangers are caused by human intervention, and it is only through changed attitudes and behavior that they can be overcome. The real enemy is humanity itself. The thing Peterson has left out for the context of the Club of Rome piece is that the group had been concerned with unchecked growth. They also were trying to get people to understand that environmental or economic disasters could be avoided or prevented. In the first global revolution, they were setting up that humanity tends to be united against common enemies. Historically, this would be one group against another, but if that mentality could be turned towards fighting the environmental downfall we're progressing towards, perhaps we'd be able to effect enough change to prevent it. Peterson is apparently missing the point of this discourse. The point isn't to eradicate humans, something I think most people would understand. The point is to get people to see the negative impact we're having on the world before we pass the threshold where it can't be fixed. The point is ultimately to save humanity, not destroy it.
A real messiah might follow through with his rigorous moral logic and eliminate himself as well. This is what mass murderers, driven by near infinite resentment, typically do. Even their own being does not justify the existence of humanity. In fact, they kill themselves precisely to demonstrate the purity of their commitment to annihilation.
Huge citation needed here, Peterson. I've gone down many a strange research hole in the course of this series, but I'm drawing the line at digging through mass murderer manifestos to see if ecology or environmentalism played a role in their actions, or anything else Peterson claimed here. And if this truly was the case, that environmentalism does this to people, why are we not seeing more environmentalists going out and committing these acts?
No one in the modern world may, without objection, express the opinion that existence would be bettered by the absence of Jews, blacks, Muslims, or Englishmen. Why, then, is it virtuous to propose that the planet might be better off if there were fewer people on it? I can't help but see a skeletal, grinning face, gleeful at the possibility of the apocalypse, hiding not so very far behind such statements. And why does it so often seem to be the very people standing so visibly against prejudice who so often appear to feel obligated to denounce humanity itself?
Is Peterson saying that mass murder is equivalent to environmentalism? I guess it needs to be remarked that not having as many kids is not the same thing as going out and killing people. Peterson sees a grinning specter itching for the apocalypse behind environmentalism, but I would argue that environmentalists are trying to prevent the world from ending. They aren't happy about the prospects.
People are suffering. People are dying. Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you?
Where did Peterson get this impression? Calling out the major polluters to try and get them to change before we're all fucked is hardly a denouncement of humanity. Some people's willingness to put their fingers in their ears and ignore the situation does make me question our species, but that doesn't mean I'm going to go out and try to fix the population situation myself. We're going to leave off here because this section takes another sharp turn into a completely different topic area, so until next time, bye!